All right, testing. Okay, so let's jump in. All right, so this week we're talking about tissues. So, tissues are groups of similar cells and the extracellular material around them. And they are collections of cells that have a common function. So, for instance, the skin provides protection and it's made up of epithelial cells. All right, and the study of tissues is known as histology. So when we look at microscope slides of tissues, we are practicing histology. There are four basic types of tissues, and they are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. And each one's going to have varied structure and form. Oops, let's go back. Let's do full screen. All right. So the epithelium is also called epithelial tissue, and it's composed of one or more layers of closely packed cells. Yeah, so if you've seen those videos of Japanese subway cars, how they have people just pushing you in, everybody's packed in, butt to butt to butt. Well, that's epithelium. Epithelium, that's like epithelium. All the cells are going to be up against each other, okay? They're going to be up against each other. We'll talk about connective tissue a little bit later, where the cells are mostly going to be pretty spaced out. With a lot of protein in between them. But right here, epithelium, all these epithelial tissues are going to be next to each other. Now, they can be in one row, one layer, or they can be in multiple layers. All right, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Epithelia contain little to no extracellular matrix. They all have what's known as a basement membrane, which is a thin layer of protein that they're attached to, but not a lot of extracellular matrix, not a lot of protein outside the cell other than that. So they cover the body's surfaces. As we mentioned, the skin is made up of epithelium, as are the mucous membranes in your nasal cavity and your mouth. Also in, for instance, the urethra. And you're going to find epithelium also lining the vagina and the entire GI tract. Okay, so from mouth to anus all the way through. Epithelial tissue. All right. Yeah, covers body surfaces, lines body cavities, and it forms the majority of glands. Most glands are a form of epithelium. So epithelial tissue have polarity. All right, so they have an apical surface, which is the top side, and they have a basal surface, which is the bottom side. Now we mentioned they all have a basement membrane, and so the basal surface is going to be attached to the basement. And the apical surface, the word apex means top, right? Like top of a pyramid, top of a mountain. All right, so the apical surface will be the top side of the epithelial cells. All right, some epithelial cells will have microvilli, for instance, in the small intestine, or they will have cilia in the trachea. All right, good, good. So, yes, they're all attached to the basement membrane. Epithelial tissues are avascular, meaning they do not have their own blood supply. Now, there is a type of epithelium called endothelium, and endothelium lines blood vessels. Blood vessels are made up of endothelium. Uh, but epithelial tissues do not have their own blood supply. They do not have their own blood vessels. So they usually sit on top of a connective tissue layer, and they will be dependent on the connective tissue layer for supplying oxygen and nutrients. Connective tissues often have, well, some connective tissues have a lot of blood vessels. We'll talk about that in a minute. Epithelial tissues are extensively innervated, especially the skin. All right, they detect changes in the environment. And they have a high capacity for regeneration. In other words, they can divide and replace themselves. Remember, not all cells are able to do that. Muscle and nerve cells, for instance, cannot divide and replace themselves. Connective tissue cells do it, but typically pretty slowly, especially in, say, bone or cartilage. Um, but in the epithelia, those cells do rapidly divide and replace themselves, and they're constantly dying off and being replaced, especially in the skin. All right, so here we see the apical surface on top, the basal surface on the bottom, and that's sitting on top of a thin layer of protein called the basement membrane. And the basement membrane is like just a protein sheet that all these cells are anchored to. All right. Now, you may also notice that this epithelium is sitting on top of connective tissue. If you look down at the connective tissue, all those purple dots you see, those are the cells that make up this connective tissue, and you can see that they are spaced apart from each other, as opposed to the epithelial cells, which are all up against each other. The connective tissue cells are separated from each other by space, and in that space you see all these wavy pink lines. That's protein that makes up the extracellular matrix. Most of that is collagen. All right. Now, down below in the connective tissue, you see a blood vessel. Okay. Now, the blood vessels run through the connective tissue. Oxygen and nutrients will diffuse out of the blood vessel and into the connective tissue. And then from there, oxygen and nutrients will diffuse across the basement membrane toward the epithelial cells. And so epithelial cells don't have their own blood supply. They're dependent on the underlying connective tissue for oxygen and nutrients. Also for getting rid of waste, dumping those out in the blood. All right. So, yeah, epithelia can be good for physical protection. Of course, we mentioned the skin. That's one of its primary jobs is protection. And of course, there are multiple layers of epithelial cells in the skin, and whenever we bump into an object or scrape our knee or something, we just scrape off, slough off the top layer of cells, the topmost layers of cells, and there are underlying cells below that that will maintain the barrier and then divide to replace the ones we lost. The epithelial tissues are selectively permeable, so only certain things get in. Going back to the skin again, I just think it's really interesting what you can deliver through the skin and what people think you can deliver through the skin. So obviously you can put on a nicotine patch, right? Nicotine patches work. So nicotine does through the skin. It's small and it's able to pass through the skin. It is, we would say, transdermal. On the other hand, collagen, people buy collagen creams and things like that, and collagen is actually too big to get through the skin. And so when we say the epithelium, in this case the skin, is selectively permeable, certain things can get through. It's permeable to certain things like nicotine, but it's not permeable to other things like collagen. Collagen's too big to get through. All right, give me just a moment. I gotta find the charger for this headset. It's dying. All right, so some cells are specialized to secrete. These would be the glandular epithelium. Excuse me, the glandular epithelium. So you would find that in something like the saliva glands or the sweat glands. All right. And then sensation. So these supply information to the nervous system. We have sensory fibers running through the epithelium, in many cases, especially in the skin. All right, so we can classify these epithelial tissues by their cell layers. You have simple, stratified, and pseudostratified epithelia. By the way, epithelia is the plural of epithelium, singular. All right, now simple epithelium is one cell layer thick. So in other words, there's one cell layer, one layer of cells in simple epithelium. And this makes it good for things like filtration, absorption, or secretion, right? Because if you were secretory epithelia, if you were producing a product that needed to be secreted, you wouldn't want to have to pump it very far, right? You would want to just pump it straight out into the gland duct. With absorption, again, one cell layer thick means that things that we are absorbing don't have very far to go. So you will find simple epithelium in the intestine where we are absorbing nutrients, and so we don't want them to have to go very far. And yeah, you'll also find simple epithelium in the lungs. Again, so that we can have oxygen diffuse rapidly out of the air in the lungs and then into the blood. Same with carbon dioxide, having that diffuse out of the blood and into the air in the lungs so that we can breathe that out. And then filtration, the capillaries in the tissues perform what's called filtration, which is where the blood pressure in the capillaries forces fluid out. Okay. All right, so certain things will get through. Large proteins, large plasma proteins cannot get through, but small things like ions and sugars typically will. All right, and then good. Next up, we have stratified epithelium, which has multiple cell layers. It's two or more layers thick, but it's almost always several layers thick. Um, with the stratified epithelium, only the bottom row is in contact with the basement membrane in stratified epithelium. That's true of simple epithelium also, but in simple epithelium, you only have the bottom row. Uh, and then you find stratified epithelium in areas subjected to mechanical stress. In other words, things that may come into contact with physical objects, and a single cell layer could be damaged by that. But by having multiple cell layers, we can lose the top layer of cells, and we still have cells underneath that to replace them. All right, so this would be areas like the skin, the vagina, the rectum, which comes into contact with, of course, sometimes hard feces. When these things come into contact with a physical object, we just lose the top layer of cells. That term is sloughing off the top layer of cells, and they are replaced by the underlying cells. Now, the last one we have here is pseudostratified epithelium. Pseudo means false or fake. All right, so these are falsely stratified epithelia. They look like they're layered. They look like there are multiple rows, but if you look closely, there aren't. All the cells are in contact with the basement membrane. Yeah, not all of them will reach the apical surface. Now, you can also classify them by shape. All right, and so we have cells that are, we say, squamous. These are flat, wide. They're sometimes irregular in shape. Sometimes they're kind of square shaped. A square is two-dimensional, right? In other words, a square is flat. Cubes are three-dimensional, but squares are flat. And so these cells will look flat. Cuboidal cells are cube, right? So they're about as tall as they are wide. And then they're going to have kind of a three-dimensional cube shape. The nucleus will be spherical and in the center of the cell. Then we have columnar cells, which look like a column. So these are going to be tall and slender, right? So not as wide as they are tall. Good. They'll have a oval-shaped nucleus. And then lastly, we have transitional cells. Transitional epithelia, they change shape depending on how the epithelium is stretched, and you're going to find them in the urinary bladder and the ureters, which are tubes that connect the kidneys to the urinary bladder. Basically, you'll only find it in the urinary system. Transitional epithelium. They not only change shape, but they're actually able to slide over each other as well. Transitional epithelia. All right, now here in the image you can see simple epithelium. This is one cell layer thick. Everything's in contact with the basement membrane. These are also squamous cells. They're pretty flat looking cells, okay? Then you have down below that stratified epithelium, and this is actually a model for the skin here, and you can see on the basal level we have sort of cube-shaped cells, but as the cells divide and push up, they get flattened into the squamous shape. And so typically we say the skin has stratified squamous epithelium, even though the basal layer is cuboidal. Lastly, you have the columnar cells, which are taller than they are wide, and you can see these cell shapes over on the right side. All right. So we can combine these terms to create phrases like simple squamous epithelium. So here we're talking about one cell layer thick of square-shaped epithelial cells. Okay, so these are going to be kind of flattened, and they are the thinnest barrier, so they are good for, say, in the lungs, and down below you have a picture of the lungs here. They're thin, and so the oxygen in the air that we breathe in can diffuse rapidly through these very thin cells and into the bloodstream. Same with getting rid of CO2. CO2 is carried to the lungs by the blood. It is a waste byproduct that we have to get rid of, and so it will diffuse into the air in the lungs and then be breathed out very quickly. You also find simple squamous epithelium in the walls of blood vessels. This is also known as the endothelium, and they uh, they also, because they're so thin, they allow for rapid diffusion of oxygen through the vessel wall. And carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide diffuses from the tissues into the blood in the capillaries. All right, and then of course they're in serous membranes as well. Then we have the simple cuboidal epithelium. This is a single layer of cube-shaped cells. Good, and so you'll find these lining things like kidney tubules. All right, they're good for ducts. They make the ductal part of glands. Then we have simple columnar epithelium, which is a single layer of column-shaped cells. All right, and there are two types, ciliated and non-ciliated. And then on the ciliated epithelia, the cilia can be modal or non-modal. In other words, the cilia might move or they might not. All right, so non-ciliated, simple columnar epithelium do not have cilia, but they do have microvilli. And they create a fuzzy structure called the brush border in the small intestine. So this fuzzy structure made up of all these finger-like projections coming out of the top of these cells. They're lined with enzymes that will break down nutrients in the intestine. For instance, we mentioned before we need to break down disaccharides, and so this is where you would find the enzyme lactase is embedded in the microvilli on the apical surface. If you have lactase, that's where you would find it. They also have unicellular glands. This is glands made up of one cell called goblet cells. And if you look down below, you can kind of see a goblet cell here. It's this oval-shaped white structure in the tissue. It's shaped kind of like a goblet, sort of, if you squint real hard. You know what a goblet is? It's like a king's cup, the kind of cup a king would hold in an old time medieval movie or TV show. They secrete the glycoprotein called mucin, which thickens up fluids and creates mucus. And yeah, they form mucus when you mix mucin with water. All right, so you'll find these lining most of the digestive tract from the stomach to the anal canal. All right, then we have ciliated simple columnar epithelium, and here the cilia can move and typically do move, and they push mucus along. They'll also have goblet cells. And so in the trachea, you find these ciliated simple columnar cells, and And the cilia, again, they move, they beat, and when they do, they move mucus along. That mucus is captured dust and bacteria that were in the air. And so the cilia move, they push that mucus up over to the esophagus, we swallow it, and then break that stuff down. Uh, I think we may have mentioned smokers frequently have a chronic cough because smoking paralyzes or destroys the cilia, and smokers have to cough to compensate. They're no longer moving that mucus up, slowly and normally with the cilia. They've got to cough to move it manually. And you'll find this in, the it says here bronchioles. That's not right. You'll find it in the trachea and the primary bronchi. And then in the uterine tubes as well, helps move the egg cell along to the uterus. All right, so pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It looks like it's multiple layers of cells, but it's not really stratified. All the cells are touching the basement membrane, although not all of the cells will reach the apical surface. So there are two forms here, ciliated and non-ciliated. The ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium contains cilia on the apical surface, and they have protective functions. They trap foreign particles that are moved by the cilia, trapped in the mucus and moved along by the cilia. And they're located in the large passageways of the respiratory system as well. So the non-ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, it's pretty rare. It does not have cilia, but it has protective functions. And you'll find this mainly in the male urethra and the epididymis, which is a structure in the male reproductive tract. All right, so the stratified squamous epithelium, this is where we'll have multiple layers of the flattened cells. Only the deepest layer is in contact with the basement membrane. And the basal layers will typically have a cuboidal shape, as we said when we saw that skin slide, but the apical cells have a squamous flattened shape. And they help protect against abrasion and friction. Again, we can lose the top layer of cells. The stem cells in the basal layer will continuously divide. Only the cells in the basal layer are dividing. And they replace cells that were lost at the surface. So you can have it in keratinized and non-keratinized forms. So in other words, that's with the protein called keratin or without the protein called keratin. Cells that produce the protein keratin are called keratinocytes. Keratin's another one of those proteins they put in lotions to get people to buy them, thinking it'll rejuvenate their skin. But I believe keratin's going to be too big to pass through the skin. Almost definitely. Without having looked it up. I have looked up collagen. Way too big to get through the skin. Anyway, all right. So keratin makes the cells strong, right? Really strong. The cells are going to fill up with keratin, and then they will die. So we find this in, yes, the skin. The non-keratinized form looks very similar, but it lacks the protein keratin, and so you'll find this in the mucous membranes, especially in the oral cavity, the vagina, and the rectum. All right. So stratified cuboidal epithelium, two or more layers of cuboidal epithelium. All right. They help form tubes and coverings to organs, therefore protection and secretion, and they form the walls of ducts in most of the exocrine glands. So you'll find them in the sweat glands, parts of the male urethra, and the outside of the ovarian follicles. Stratified columnar epithelium is rare. All right. It has two or more layers of cells. Now, with stratified columnar epithelium, it really is usually two layers. All right, so it protects and secretes, and you're going to find it in the large ducts of salivary glands and parts of the male urethra. Transitional epithelium, we mentioned, is limited to the urinary tract. So it can be in a relaxed state or a stretched state. In the relaxed state, the basal cells are cuboidal and polyhedral, meaning they have many sides, many shapes. The apical cells are large and rounded. In the stretched state, the apical cells become flattened. These cells are binucleated, meaning they have two nuclei, and they allow for stretching as the bladder fills. So here you can see the two states of the transitional epithelium. All right. All right, so glands are individual cells or multicellular organs composed of epithelial tissue. Many glands are composed of epithelial tissue, not necessarily all. All right, and they can be endocrine or exocrine glands. Endocrine glands secrete internally, hence the name endo, and then exocrine glands are secreting outside of the body, so the term exo is used. All right, now endocrine glands do not have ducts. Endocrine glands produce their product and directly secrete it, well, into the environment around them, but it diffuses from there into the bloodstream. So endocrine glands have a rich blood supply, and so they secrete their products out of the cell, and then that diffuses quickly into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands do have a duct, and they are going to secrete their product into a duct, which carries their secretory product to the surface of the body. All right. So you'll find this in sweat glands as well as the mammary glands. They have a duct which carries milk out through the nipple, and then the salivary glands also have a duct which carry fluid out into the oral cavity. Now, the oral cavity is technically outside your body, and we'll discuss that more in the digestive system unit. All right, so there are also unicellular exocrine glands that do not have a duct. They're located in the epithelial surface. The most common type is the goblet cell that we mentioned before. There are multicellular exocrine glands that have numerous cells, and many of them will have what's known as an acinus or acini plural. And it's sort of a, can I draw on here? No, I can't. So let's open up Paint. No, I want to freehand it. Brush. Okay. All right, so here's a duct. And then here's a bulbous structure at the end. All right, now the duct and the bulbous structure are going to be made up of epithelial cells. And so here I'm drawing lines to show kind of the divisions between the epithelial cells. Just pretend that goes all the way around, just to save us some time, right? All right, so anyway, here are the epithelial cells that make up the duct and the acinus. All right. Good, good, good. So in the acinus, this is where we are going to be producing the secretory product. This is where you will find the glandular epithelium in glands that are set up like this, and then they're carried out through the duct. All right. Good, 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 good. So the salivary glands have an acinus and duct system. The pancreas has an acinus and duct system. The mammary glands have an acinus and duct system. Oh, great, and we can see that here. All right, so you can see the acinus here, plural acini, leading to the duct. We'll talk about that more when we get to the endocrine and digestive units. All right, so glands can be classified by their anatomic form. So we have simple glands, which are single unbranched, have single unbranched ducts. Compound glands that have branched ducts. Tubular glands that have a secretory portion and duct that are the same diameter. Basically, the gland looks like a duct, not like that acinus shape we just saw. Then you have the acinar glands, which have the secretory portion in that expanded sac, that's the acinus, and the tubuloacinar glands that have both tubules and acini. All right, so in the image here you can see a simple tubular gland. It is tube-shaped, no bulged acinus. To the right you see a simple branched tubular gland. All right. To the right of that you see a simple coiled tubular gland. To the right of that, a simple acinar gland with the duct and the acinus. And to the right of that, you have the simple branched acinar gland with the branching and the acini. Down below that, you have the compound gland, where you're going to have the branched duct. All right, that leads to multiple secretory portions. All right, this is the compound tubular. Then you can tell the difference by now. We see the compound acinar. Then on the right, you have the compound tubuloacinar, where we have tubules and acini present. All right, so you can classify exocrine glands by their method of secretion also, and this is more common. You have the merocrine glands, the apocrine glands, and the holocrine glands. And the merocrine glands package their secretion into vesicles that are released by exocytosis. Basically, their secretion is going to be bundled up in a membrane-bound sac. That sac comes up and it fuses with the membrane of the cell, and then the contents of that sac get dumped out outside of the cell into a acinus or duct. And so the examples here are the lacrimal glands, which are the tear glands, and the salivary glands. All right. Then you have the apocrine glands, and the apocrine glands, with them, the apical portion of the membrane pinches off. Basically, the cell loses like the top 1/3. The top 1/3 of the cell just pinches off and gets released, and that's the secretory product. So the examples here are the mammary and the ceruminous glands, but we also have apocrine sweat glands in the armpit and groin. And then lastly, you have the holocrine glands, which themselves get destroyed and become the secretion. Excuse me. So the example here are the sebaceous glands, which are the oil glands of the skin. Merocrine secretion is non-destructive because the cell does not get destroyed. It just dumps some vesicles and their contents out onto the surface. Holocrine gland secretion is destructive because the cell gets destroyed in order to make the secretory product, sebaceous oil or sebum. And then lastly, apocrine glands are semi-destructive because part of the cell gets pinched off and destroyed, but the entire cell, not the entire cell, part of the cell remains and lives. All right, so here you can see the merocrine gland secreting vesicles toward the apical surface, and they dump their contents out into the acinus and duct. In the middle, you can see the apocrine gland, and hopefully you can see that the top 1/3 of the cell is getting pinched off, and that becomes the actual secretory product. So the examples there were the mammary gland and the ceruminous glands, which are your earwax glands. And then over on the right, you see the holocrine gland, where the glandular epithelium is destroyed and it becomes the secreted product. All right, just a second. So all connective tissue, by the way, we're moving on to connective tissue. That was it for epithelium. All connective tissue has three basic components: cells, protein fibers, and ground substance. So cells, we know what those are. Protein fibers are produced by the cells and they fill up the extracellular matrix. They fill up the space between cells. And then also in the extracellular matrix, you find ground substance, which is the kind of thick fluid surrounding the cells and in that interstitial space. All right, so cells, there are classes of connective tissue that have specific cell types. Most cells do not are not in direct contact with each other. They're not touching each other. They're spaced out. And then there are two classes of cells here: resident cells and wandering cells. In other words, resident cells are cells that are there all the time, and wandering cells are cells that may come and go. All right, so the resident cells support, maintain, and repair the extracellular matrix. So the examples include fibroblasts. That's one of the main connective tissue cell types. Um, they're abundant in proper connective tissue, which we'll talk about in a second, and they produce the fibers and the ground substance of the extracellular matrix. We also have adipocytes, which are fat cells, and they appear in small clusters in some types of connective tissue proper. Um, good. So adipose tissue these are the cells that hold on to fat, store fat long term for us. But then we have wandering cells, and they're mainly going to be things like white blood cells or leukocytes. These are things that enter the tissue to help repair the damaged extracellular matrix and look for invaders, look for pathogens or harmful agents and destroy them. So for wandering cells, you can have free macrophages. These are phagocytic cells. In other words, these are cells that eat bacteria, eat pathogens. They engulf them and bring them in and digest them. And then for other leukocytes, other white blood cells, we have neutrophils and T lymphocytes. Neutrophils also phagocytize bacteria. They also eat bacteria. And then the T lymphocytes attack foreign looking materials, things that don't look like they belong in the body. So for protein fibers, the most abundant one is going to be collagen, which involves unbranched cable-like long fibers. And collagen is going to be especially numerous in tendons and ligaments. That's going to be mostly collagen, very densely packed. We also have reticular fibers, which are similar to collagen but thinner, and they're abundant in the stroma or the kind of the of some organs. All right, then we have elastic fibers, which contain the protein elastin, which gives, as you would expect, which gives the tissue stretch and recoil, the property of stretch and recoil. And it's found in skin and in the walls of arteries. Arteries, by the way, whenever the heart pumps, whenever it contracts, the blood pressure shoots up and the walls of the arteries have to stretch out. All right, so ground substance. This is a non-cellular material produced by connective tissue cells. It's where the connective tissue cells and the protein fibers exist. And it's thick, in other words, viscous. It's semi-solid in cartilage, or it's solid in bone. So the ground substance and the protein fibers together make up the extracellular matrix. And so we can see an image here. You can see some fibroblasts. You can see macrophages, adipocytes. The wandering cells, the macrophages, the resident cells, the fibroblasts, and adipocytes. All right. And then woven in between them are the thick collagen fibers, the elastin fibers, and the reticular fibers. You also see some blood vessels in the image. All right, and then ground substance is going to be filling up all the space between the protein fibers. Anything in here not filled up by protein fibers is filled up by ground substance. All right, so here's the clinical view for scurvy. Collagen is an important protein, and it strengthens and supports almost all of the body's tissues. Vitamin C is essential for healthy collagen fibers. Vitamin C is a cofactor used to make collagen. And so scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C. It was common among pirates and sailors who would be, in the 17 and 1800s, they'd be out at sea for several months eating nothing but biscuits. And so the symptoms include weakness, gum ulceration, hemorrhages, abnormal bone growth. Your teeth may also fall out because of the gum ulceration. Uh, Right. And so it's treated by consuming foods that are high in vitamin C or supplements containing vitamin C. It's not very common anymore. Vitamin C is in everything. Vitamin C, it turns out, is actually a preservative. You'll see it as an ingredient in a lot of products called ascorbic acid. Truth be told, we're probably taking in way too much vitamin C these days. So moving on. Functions of connective tissue. It's good for physical protection, the support and structural framework of organs, the binding of structures, storage, transport, and immune protection, because some of these connective tissues contain white blood cells. All right, so the mesenchyme is the source for all other connective tissue cells. Adult connective tissue often has mesenchymal stem cells. The mesenchyme was a developmental tissue, and there's a population of mesenchymal stem cells that stick around and they divide to replace connective tissue cells. The mucous connective tissue is found only in the umbilical cord. So that's all we're going to say about the mucous connective tissue. Marfan syndrome, another clinical view here. It's a rare genetic disease of the connective tissue, and it causes skeletal, cardiovascular, and visual abnormalities. People with Marfan syndrome have an abnormal chromosome 15, and symptoms include abnormally long fingers, toes, and limbs. The limbs are longer than they should be. And we also see a malformation of the thoracic cage as well as the vertebral column. They have easily dislocated joints that result from weak ligaments, tendons, and joint capsules. They also have a weakness in the aorta and abnormal heart valves that frequently shortens their lives. You may also see a slipped lens of the eye. Often we see death occur before the age of 50 due to the, cardiovascular problems, the weakness in the aorta, and the abnormal heart valves. Early diagnosis and medical management can allow a long lifespan. There are some people who think that Abraham Lincoln may have had Marfan syndrome, but we will never, we're not going to dig up an American president just to find out if he had Marfan syndrome. All right, so connective tissue proper. This includes loose connective tissue, which has few cells and protein fibers, fewer than in the dense connective tissue anyway. We see the protein fibers are going to be sparse, meaning even the fibers are pretty spaced out, and they're irregularly arranged. And they're abundant, they have abundant ground substance. They are the body's quote unquote packing material, and they support structures. There are three types of loose connective tissue. We have areolar, adipose, and reticular connective tissue. So first up in the areolar connective tissue, if you look in either the slide or the cartoon to the right at the bottom, You can see the cells, which are the fibroblasts that produce the tissues, produce the ground substance and the protein fibers. You can see the protein fibers, and you can see the ground substance. And you can see there's a lot of ground substance and not that much protein. All right, there's space in between the cells and the protein fibers. All right, so this is loose areolar connective tissue. All right, and it's found in the papillary layer of the dermis, so the top layer of the dermis, part of the skin we'll talk about, as well as the subcutaneous layer and the surrounding organs, nerve and muscle cells, and blood cells. Blood vessels. So adipose connective tissue is commonly referred to as fat or fat tissue. These are the cells, the adipocytes. These are the cells that hold on to energy long term for us, and there are two types. White, which stores energy long term and acts as an insulator or cushion. You will find it around certain organs to protect them from, falls and things like that. So adults have almost entirely, should have entirely white adipose. Brown adipose is found in newborns, and it generates heat, and it's lost as we age. Now, brown adipose, it holds on to fat, but it also burns fat to release heat, heat to keep the newborn alive and keep it from getting cold. As we age, we don't need to generate heat, and at least our body thinks, we need to hold on to fat, and so we will transition to white adipose as we age. Brown adipose is baby fat. So adipose gain or loss is due to adipocytes enlarging or shrinking. When they fill up with fat, the fat droplet in the center of the cell grows, and when they release fats, the fat droplet will shrink. Now, we did say that most connective tissues are spaced out from one another, and you may be looking at the adipose cartoon down there and saying, well, they're all touching. Well, they start spaced out. Adipocytes start spaced out, but as they fill with fat, as their fat droplets grow, they will grow to the point where they are touching other cells. All right. Then we have reticular connective tissue, which forms a meshwork of reticular fibers, fibroblasts, and of course leukocytes as well. And so you'll find this in the pulp of many organs, such as the spleen, the thymus, lymph nodes, and bone marrow. All right, so connective tissue proper. That was loose connective tissue. Loose connective tissue was areolar, reticular, and adipose. Now we are moving into dense connective tissue proper. All right. And so the dense connective tissue proper, these cells, they're still going to be spaced out from one another, but the space between them is going to be filled with protein. Right. So the cells are going to be spaced out. There's not so much ground substance. There's a lot more protein in dense connective tissue. In other words, it's kind of densely packed. All right, so it's going to be, yes, mostly protein fibers, less ground substance, and the collagen fibers will be the most dominant form of fiber. We see three categories of dense connective tissue. You have dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic connective tissue. All right. So dense regular connective tissue is tightly packed, and the collagen fibers are parallel. If we look at the tissue slide down below, you can see that they follow a regular repeating pattern. And so that's how, as a student, I remembered dense regular connective tissue. The protein is packed densely, and the fibers are following a regular repeating pattern. Okay. They're all parallel. They're all running in the same direction. And you're going to find this in tendons and ligaments. Stress is typically applied in a single direction in the tendons and ligaments. You're going to find few blood vessels. Because there are few blood vessels, there aren't a lot of nutrients available to tendons and ligaments, and so when they get damaged, they'll take a long time to heal. Again, because there are few blood vessels. All right, so dense, irregular connective tissue. Again, we see that the proteins are packed pretty tightly. Not a lot of ground substance, although a little more than we saw in dense regular. And the protein fibers are not going to be following a regular repeating pattern. They appear to be running just kind of all over the place. So we find this in the dermis of the skin, the periosteum of the bone, the layer surrounding the periosteum, the perichondrium, which surrounds cartilage, as well as the capsules around the internal organs. And then lastly, we have a less elastic connective tissue, which is branching and it has densely packed elastic fibers. Because there's so much elastin here, it's able to stretch and recoil. And this is found in the walls of large arteries, as well as the trachea and the vocal cords. All right. The third type of connective tissue, remember we had loose, dense, and now supporting connective tissue, includes cartilage and bone. Cartilage is firm, it's semi-solid with its extracellular matrix. It's made up mostly of collagen and elastic protein fibers. The cells in cartilage are called chondrocytes. Remember, chondro means cartilage, and so chondrocytes are cartilage cells. And they're surrounded by a small space called a lacuna. Lacunae is plural, more than one. And they're surrounded by a dense, irregular connective tissue covering known as the perichondrium. All right. So cartilage is stronger and more resilient than other connective tissue types, but it's more flexible than bone. An area of the bodies that need support and must withstand deformation, we find cartilage. So this would be like the tip of the nose. Also the ears. Yeah, the ears are made up of, the pinna is made up of cartilage. And in the mature state, cartilage is avascular. All right. So there are three types of cartilage. That's hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Hyaline cartilage has a clear kind of glassy look under the microscope, and if you look down at the tissue image down there on the left, you can see it's pretty smooth. You don't see the protein fibers so much. They're there, but you don't really see them so much. It's a smooth appearance here. And then the cells there, you may see that surrounding the chondrocytes, there's like a thin white disc, right? They exist inside of a thin white disc. And that is the lacuna. And so chondrocytes, when they start out as a cell type called chondroblasts. And they start secreting the matrix around them, and they secrete until they're surrounded. And they carve out a little space for themselves here called the lacuna. It's like a little studio apartment for just this one cell. And then outside of the lacuna is the extracellular matrix. Alright. Now, hyaline cartilage is found in the nose, the trachea, the larynx, as well as the costal cartilages. Those are the cartilages of the ribs. And you also find it at the articular ends of long bones. What's the articular end? That's the end where we have joints, the part of the bone where we have joints. And then most of the fetal skeleton will be made up of cartilage. So a fetus's skeleton is mostly cartilage, and then leading up to birth, it begins to ossify or turn to bone. All right, so fibrocartilage is a weight-bearing cartilage. It resists compression. The protein fibers are arranged in irregular bundles between the chondrocytes. And if you look down here, you can see those irregular bundles, that wavy, rough look. Okay. And because this is good at resisting compression, you're going to find it in the intervertebral discs. These are the discs between the vertebrae in your spinal column. All right, and then also in the pubic symphysis, which joins the two halves of the pelvis together in the front, and then also in the menisci of the knee joint. The menisci are basically pads inside the knee joint. They're pads in there that resist compression, and they're made up of fibrocartilage. Elastic cartilage is going to be flexible, springy. It has numerous densely packed elastic fibers, and the elastic fibers in that image below are the ones that are darkly staining purple. The chondrocytes in this tissue will be closely packed together, surrounded by a perichondrium, and they're located in the external ear and the epiglottis. The epiglottis is the covering over the trachea that prevents you from breathing water when you swallow water. The next supportive connective tissue is bone. Now, bone is more solid than cartilage, and it offers greater support, but it's less flexible. Basically, the stronger you are, the more support you can offer, but the more likely you are to break, right? So it has organic components such as collagen and glycoproteins. It also has inorganic components such as calcium salts and phosphates. So the bone cells are known as the osteocytes, and just like the chondrocytes, osteocytes come from a early cell type called osteoblasts, and osteoblasts secrete matrix out around themselves until they're surrounded in a little lacuna, just like with the chondroblasts. And once they're surrounded in their little lacuna, they become a mature osteocyte. The osteoblast becomes an osteocyte once it has surrounded itself in extracellular matrix and trapped itself in its own little lacuna. So there are two types of bone, compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone is of course going to be more compact, it's stronger, and it's perforated by canals that allow blood vessels and nerve cells to pass through. And it's arranged in a cylindrical structure called an osteon, which is made up of concentric rings made up of bone. The spongy bone is located in the interior of the bone, and it forms a latticework structure, which is strong and lightweight. We have a picture? No, we don't. All right. Yeah, okay. So bone functions. The bones are levers for movement. When the muscles contract, they apply force to the bones in order to move the skeleton. They also support the tissues and protect vital organs. For instance, the thoracic cage surrounds the lungs and heart and protects them. They store minerals. So when our blood calcium levels are low, we will dissolve bone to release calcium into the blood. When our blood calcium levels are high, we will store it in the bone. We will start making new layers of bone when our blood calcium is high. The bone marrow houses hemopoietic cells, and these are the stem cells that make new blood cells. All right, so here you can see the bone, the compact bone, arranged into osteons. You can see the cylindrical structure, right? The cylindrical structure composed of concentric rings made of bone. These concentric rings are known as concentric lamellae. Lamella is just uh, another word for layer. All right. Now at the center, you find the central canal, and that's the canal where you find blood vessels and nerves passing through. Our last type of connective tissue is the fluid connective tissue, and there's only one fluid connective tissue, uh, depending on which textbook you read, and that's blood. Some will also include lymph. All right, now blood is a fluid connective tissue that has formed elements in it, and the formed elements are the cells. All right. So erythrocytes, or red blood cells, they transport the respiratory gases. They transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. Leukocytes, or white blood cells, protect against infectious agents. And then there are cellular fragments called platelets that help clot blood. Basically, there's a cell called a megakaryocyte, which grows and then breaks apart, and all the fragments of that cell are called platelets. All right, there is a liquid ground substance in the blood called plasma. All right, the extracellular matrix of blood is liquid. It's basically water with plasma proteins dissolved in it, also dissolved nutrients, wastes, and hormones. Lymph is derived from the blood plasma, and there are no cells or fragments in the lymph, and it's going to return fluid to the bloodstream. Basically, the lymph nodes pick up fluids from the tissues, excess fluids from the tissues, and then they return them to the circulation. Here you can see some red blood cells. They appear to have a biconcave disc shape. That's what all of the textbooks say, biconcave disc, meaning it's a disc that is concave on two sides. I think it looks kind of like a raft. You can also see here some other blood cells, the white blood cells, the neutrophil and the lymphocyte. What about this? One thing you'll notice from that image down there is that the vast majority of blood cells are going to be red blood cells, not white blood cells. In fact, honestly, they're being kind of generous with this image. There are much more red blood cells than there are white blood cells. All right, so that was connective tissue. We've covered epithelium so far, then we covered connective tissue. Now all we have left is muscle and nervous tissue. Okay. We are going to dedicate a chapter or two to the muscle, and so we'll cover most of this information when we get there. And then with the nervous tissue, we've got like at least 3 chapters on it, so we'll dedicate a whole unit to the nervous tissue later. But for now, let's get into the basics. Muscle tissue, here you have, it contracts when it's stimulated. Some of it you can move voluntarily, some of it you can't. Some is responsible for contracting the heart and pumping blood through the body. And then, well, let's just get specific. Skeletal muscle, there are 3 types down here. Skeletal muscle is responsible for the voluntary movement of the body. Cardiac muscle is responsible for contraction of the heart, and smooth muscle is responsible for propelling material through the digestive tract and the urinary tract. All right, so skeletal muscle is also known as striated or voluntary muscle. It's known as striated muscle because you can see striations like bands in the tissue when you look at it under a microscope. It's also called voluntary tissue because it's the tissue, the muscle tissue, that we can choose to control. We do not choose to control cardiac muscle, and we do not choose to control smooth muscle. So skeletal muscle is called skeletal muscle because it moves the skeleton. When it contracts, it moves our body around. And this muscle has long cylindrical cells. How long? Well, the skeletal muscle cell, or skeletal muscle fiber, runs the entire length of the anatomical muscle. And so if you look at your bicep, please understand that one skeletal muscle fiber, one skeletal muscle cell runs the entire length of that bicep. Okay? The longest muscle in the body is actually found in the thigh. It's called the sartorius, and it's actually kind of difficult to visualize. You've probably never seen it before, but we'll point it out in the muscle unit. So yeah, these muscle cells, they can be, like up to a foot long, depending on the length of the muscle. And they are arranged in parallel bundles that, yes, run the entire length of the muscle. They are multinucleated. That makes sense, right? So the nucleus copies genes, right, into mRNA, and then we make proteins when we translate that mRNA, right? Um, if your muscle cell is a foot long, that is a really long way for one nucleus to send mRNA out or send proteins out. So we have multiple nuclei along the length of the muscle cell, and that helps us keep up with the protein demands of muscle. It also has those alternating light and dark bands we mentioned called striation. And it does not contract unless it's stimulated by the somatic nervous system. In other words, it does not contract unless you choose to contract it. Now, there are parts of the nervous system that are involved in say, reflexes. That's technically the somatic nervous system, but you're not consciously choosing to move muscle in the event of a reflex. But for the most part, skeletal muscle uh, only contracts when you tell it to. It definitely only contracts when it's stimulated. Here you can see those alternating patterns of light and dark, especially in the purple, the light purple, dark purple, light purple, dark purple. That is striation. All right. And in the cartoon, as well as in the histological slide, you can see multiple nuclei. Excuse me, just a second. All right, so moving on. Cardiac muscle is confined to the middle layer of the heart wall. It's the only place you'll find it is in the heart, and it's in the middle layer. Now, when we say confined, it is a very thick layer. It's the thickest layer of the heart wall, but yeah, that's the only place you'll find it is in the wall of the heart. And it makes up the myocardium, again, that middle layer, and it's responsible for heart contraction, which is responsible for pumping blood. It has visible striation also. And the cells here, though, are going to be short. They're not long like the skeletal muscle fibers. They're going to be short, and they may bifurcate, which means they may split off in two directions. Kind of interesting. Skeletal muscle, remember that was one long cylinder, one long, basically tube-shaped cell. And here the cells may bifurcate or split off in two directions. Now, cardiac muscle can have one or two nuclei. It can be multinucleated, but isn't always. And then the cells are connected by intercalated discs, which hold them together. It strengthens the connection between the cells. And in the intercalated discs, you find gap junctions. Remember gap junctions we talked about last time? Those are like windows between two sides of a duplex, right? You could pass certain things through that window, like you could pass water and a basketball and things like that to the other side through a window. Um, but you couldn't pass a couch through, right? And so with these gap junctions, large proteins can't get through, but water and sugar and most importantly, ions can get through. Because the ions can get through, if we stimulate one cardiac muscle cell, the ions will flow through the gap junctions into the next one and start stimulating that cell. All right, and so that'll be really important in the cardiac unit when we get there. Involuntary. So cardiac muscle is involuntary. We cannot, with our brain, tell the heart to beat. In fact, even the subconscious or unconscious part of the brain that we're not responsible for controlling, even that part of the brain cannot tell the heart to beat. The brain tells the heart speed up or slow down, but the heart actually beats all on its own. It stimulates itself to beat, and it has pacemaker cells that are going to be responsible for maintaining the timing. Now here, down on the left, you can see that pattern of light and dark again, that striation, okay? On the right in the cartoon, they show it pretty clearly. You've got the one cell in the middle, which is going to branch off, okay, in two different directions. So that's bifurcation there. See those squiggly lines between the cells? Those are the intercalated discs that connect them. And in those intercalated discs, again, we have the gap junctions that allow especially ions to flow through and spread the electrical signal to contract. Last up, we have smooth muscle tissue, also known as visceral or involuntary muscle tissue. And this is another muscle tissue that we do not tell to contract, at least not consciously, right? Good. The brain can tell it to contract, but not the conscious part of our brain that we're controlling. Talk about that in the nervous system when we get there. All right, so it lacks striation and it appears to be smooth, so it gets the name smooth muscle. The cells here are going to be spindle shaped, and they are short with one central oval shaped nucleus, and they are found in the walls of the intestines, stomach, airways, bladder, uterus, and blood vessels. Basically, smooth muscle is responsible for the movement of substances in the GI tract. It's also responsible for controlling the diameter of the airways. When it contracts in the airways, it causes them to constrict, and when it relaxes, it allows them to open up. And then it's also found in the bladder, and when it contracts in the bladder, it squeezes the bladder and forces urine out of the body. We also find it in the uterus, and when it contracts in the uterus, it pushes the baby out of the body. And when you find it in the blood vessels, it will contract and it can prevent blood from entering a tissue, or on the other side, it can you can tell the smooth muscle there to relax, and if the smooth muscle relaxes, then the blood vessel will dilate and increase blood flow to the tissue. Good. In fact, that's how Viagra works, actually. It causes an increase in nitric oxide, which tells smooth muscle in the blood vessels to relax, which increases blood flow to the penis and, in truth, clitoris as well, and causes the tissues there to engorge with blood. One reason Viagra can be dangerous is that it causes all of the blood vessels, not just the ones in the reproductive tract or the reproductive system. It causes all of the blood vessels to dilate. So don't take it without talking to a doctor. All right, and again, yes, we have no voluntary control over the muscle. All right, so you can see here those spindle-shaped cells, they're pointy at both ends. They're also a lot smaller than the other muscle cells. There's no striation here. They look kind of smooth under the microscope. All right. Oval-shaped nucleus. Last basic tissue type, just to recap, we had epithelia, we had connective tissue, we had muscle tissue, and now we've got nervous tissue. Those are the four basic tissue types. Okay. Last one is nervous tissue. Now this is going to be located in the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. And the cells are called neurons. The cells that make up nervous tissue are neurons. Um, there's also another type of cell. This is just phrased kind of strangely. There's another tissue type or another cell type called glial cells, and these are the support cells that support the neurons. Now, the neurons, they receive impulses, they receive information, they transmit that information, and they process that information, and then they transmit out a response a lot of the time to muscle and gland cells. All right, so neurons, they receive information, they process it, and they transmit information back out. Then we have the glial cells, which do not conduct nerve impulses, but they do support, nourish, protect the neurons, right? So, like in the Air Force, I don't know the exact number, but not everybody flies, right? Something like 95% of the Air Force is support staff for the other 5% that does fly. People repairing planes and working in human resources and all that stuff. Good. So, parts of a neuron. The main portion is the cell body. The largest portion is the cell body where we find the nucleus. Now, the cell body is also known as the soma, S-O-M-A, soma. And sometimes you'll even see that spelled neurosoma, right? Neurosoma. Off of the cell body come nerve cell processes. They extend off of the nerve cell body. Shorter and more numerous processes are called dendrites. All right, so the dendrites receive information from other neurons or sensory cells. The axon is a long, thin process that leads away from the cell body, and that carries information to other cells. And neurons can be the longest cells in the body. That is, the longest cells in the body are going to be neurons. Not all of them are long, but the longest cells in the body will be neurons. It's a better way to phrase that. So in the nerves, for instance, I might have one neuron that runs from my spinal cord all the way down my leg, down the shin, down the foot, all the way down to the big toe. And I don't know what distance that is, but I'm just eyeballing it now. It looks something like 2.5, 3 feet. 3 feet, probably. Yeah. And so, and this one neuron I've described can be 3 feet long. That's a long cell. That's one cell, and it is really long. All right, so here in the image, you can see the soma or cell body. That's the large portion with the nucleus. The short processes coming off of it are the dendrites, which again receive information from other neurons or sensory cells. And then we have this long singular process that comes off, and that's the axon. The axon carries information away from the cell body toward the target. A neuron's always going to have a target, whether that is another neuron or a muscle cell or a gland cell. It's always going to have a target. And the axon carries information away from the cell body toward the target. All right. Then you also see here some surrounding glial cells. They surround the neuron, they protect it, they regulate its chemical environment, they nourish it. There are actually 6 types of glia, and they all have different jobs. We'll talk about that in the nervous system. All right, we're getting close to the end here. We've been talking about tissues. Now we're going to talk about organs briefly. Organs involve 2 or more tissue types that work together to perform specific complex functions. Different structures have to work together in concert. In other words, they have to work together. So the stomach contains all 4 tissue types. You'll find epithelia, connective tissue, muscle, smooth muscle. and neurons also in the stomach. All right, so it is lined by epithelium, and this epithelium secretes enzymes for digestion, also secretes acid for digestion, for breaking down foodstuff to release nutrients. There's areolar and dense connective tissue in the walls. The blood vessels in the walls are made up of, well, they're made up actually of endothelium, which is an epithelium, but all right. The areolar and dense connective tissue give the wall its shape and support. They also carry blood vessels through. They are vascular tissues. Then you see 3 layers of smooth muscle in the wall of the stomach. It contracts and relaxes to mix the stomach contents. We'll talk about that in the GI unit, the different ways it can contract. And then you see abundant nervous tissue. So not only do we get a lot of feedback from the stomach, but we also have to use that nervous tissue to control the mixing movements of the stomach, as well as glandular secretion is under nervous control, as well as hormonal. But all right, so you can see the stomach there. The body's membranes. They are formed from epithelial layers that are bound to underlying connective tissue. They line the body's cavities. They cover the organs. They cover the body's external surface. And there are 4 types of membranes. There's mucous, serous, cutaneous, and synovial. All right, so the mucous membranes, they have the columnar, usually pseudostratified columnar and goblet cells, which produce the mucus and trap that dust and bacteria moving in. Sits on top of a layer of connective tissue. You have the serous membranes, which consists of 2 layers that produce that serous fluid in between. That's produced by the epithelium, and that serous fluid is going to reduce friction and allow the lungs to basically move without destroying themselves, move without rubbing against the wall of the thorax or chest. Then you have the cutaneous membrane down there. That's the skin. You have the multiple layers, the stratified squamous epithelium sitting on top of both loose areolar and dense irregular connective tissue. And then lastly is the synovial membrane down there. The synovial membrane produces a synovial fluid which lubricates the inside of joints. And we'll find when we get to the joints unit that there are that a lot of the joints are synovial. Not all, but a lot of them. All right, so the mucous membrane. I feel like we've talked about the membranes enough at this point. All right. All right, metaplasia. This one's interesting. All right, so metaplasia is when one cell type becomes another, specifically in the epithelium. So you have cuboidal epithelia that may become squamous, or squamous epithelia that may become columnar, just as an example. So the epithelia are adapting to their environment or their environmental conditions. And so the example here is with smokers. They experience metaplastic change in the trachea epithelium. The normal pseudostratified columnar, the ciliated columnar epithelium is changed, and it becomes non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. This is one indicator that this may be an early indicator of cancer. We haven't developed cancer yet, but it may represent mutation in the cell lines there that may lead in that direction. The same thing happens with people who have chronic stomach acid as well. Gastrointestinal reflux disease, or GERD, and basically acid washes up into the lower esophagus all the time and causes these cells to divide and replace rapidly, which leads to mutations, which can cause them to experience metaplasia and change shape, and this usually precedes esophageal cancer. Not saying that GERD frequently leads to esophageal cancer, but when it does, you can usually see it in advance with this metaplastic change. Dysplasia is abnormal tissue development, so it could be precancerous or revert back to normal. It has to be closely monitored by professionals, so you can have cervical dysplasia due to exposure to human papillomavirus or HPV. Neoplasia is tissue growth that is out of control. So you can see a tumor of abnormal tissue develop, and this tumor can be benign or malignant. If it is benign, you'll see only localized growth, it doesn't spread. If it's malignant, it will metastasize, which means to spread and invade other tissues. It will become cancerous, and it can interfere with normal functioning of other tissues and lead to death of the individual. Necrosis is death of the tissue, and it's due to irreversible tissue damage. It's an inflammatory response to tissue damage. In this example here is gangrene. So with gangrene, you see necrosis of the soft tissues of a body part, and it's due to limited or diminished arterial blood supply. The tissue's not getting blood supply, in other words, and so it begins to die off. It's most common in the limbs, fingers, and toes, and it can also be a major complication of diabetes. Diabetes leads to elevated blood sugar levels, and the elevated blood sugar over long periods of time can damage your blood vessels, and if that happens, you will damage the blood supply to the limbs, fingers, and toes. All right, now intestinal gangrene follows obstruction of blood supply to the intestines, and if untreated, that will lead to death. You can also have dry gangrene, which involves desiccated and shriveled parts of the body. We usually see this in extreme cold. Wet gangrene is caused by a bacterial infection of tissues that have lost blood supply. The ruptured dying cells release fluid, which allows bacteria to flourish. And then gas gangrene involves bacteria that invade necrotic tissue or already dead tissue. The bacteria produce gas bubbles. All right, so aging of tissues. All tissues change with aging, but with proper nutrition, good health, normal circulation, and infrequent wounds, we can promote normal functioning long into old age. Support, maintenance, and replacement of cells and extracellular matrix is less efficient after middle age. And then the structure and chemical composition of many tissues will be altered. The epithelia will thin. The connective tissue loses its pliability and resiliency, loses that elastin. The collagen will also decline, which will decrease the thickness and sort of plumpness of the skin, right? The bones may become brittle because we'll begin to pull more calcium out of them than we can put in, and the muscles will atrophy. All right, so that's it. If you guys have any questions,